If you spent any time studying the history of Japan, or even just World War II, then the day August 6th, 1945 is probably familiar to you. That was the day that the American B-29 Boeing called Enola Gay dropped a nuclear warhead on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion resulted in horrific damage and devastation, leveling hundreds of buildings and contributing to a terrible human cost both in the immediate blast and in the fallout of radiation poisoning. It and the second attack on Nagasaki were the first, and, so far, only times that a nuclear weapon was ever deliberately used on another nation during warfare. Though World War II itself would end approximately 1 month later with the Japanese Instrument of Surrender being signed aboard the USS Missouri, Japan was thus left to pick up the pieces of what had happened. If one of the ways in which we try to reconcile reality is through making art, then it is no surprise that Japan, as the first victim of the atomic blasts, would make art pertaining to this moment, and anime is no exception to the rule. As a larger event during which the atomic attack occurred, World War II has been depicted in anime several times, perhaps most notably being Takahata Isao's Grave of the Fireflies or Katabuchi Sunao's In This Corner of the World. Others that would likewise fit this category include Arihara Seiji's Who's Left Behind and Masaka Mori's Barefoot Gen. However, in memorialized commemoration of that day nearly 80 years ago, television broadcasting company NHK worked with anime studio Madhouse to produce 2 specials that are often linked with one another. Girls in Summer Dresses, or Natsufuku no Shoujotachi, released on the 43rd anniversary of the Hiroshima attack in 1988, and The First Train Runs to Hiroshima, or Hiroshima ni Ichiba Densha ga Hashita, released on the 48th anniversary. These 2 bits of animation seem to have largely flown under the anime community's radar when it comes to depiction of wartime or strife brought about by war. Despite the commonality that they share and what they're each in memory of, these 2 specials approach the subject of the Hiroshima bombing in their own differing ways, which I'll be talking about in this video. Before I can actually get into talking about that, though, there are 2 things that might be of interest to anyone watching this. One is that when I was trying to do some digging on these specials, I found a couple of things rather fascinating. One is that even though they both apparently have DVDs you can purchase, every vendor I managed to find has prices for them in upwards of $30+, which is a lot to fork over for a single DVD that's not from the Criterion collection. Though thankfully piracy is a thing, so being able to see either of these is thankfully not too difficult, and heck, The First Train Runs to Hiroshima exists on YouTube in RAW form. Also, intriguingly enough, both have listed in their Anime News Network pages Mexican broadcaster XEIMT Canal 22 as a credit, nowadays known as XEIMT TDT, or just Canal 22. The other thing, and this is so important that I'm going to give it its own timestamp in the video's description, is that I need to make a rather, shall we say, substantial disclaimer at the start. I am not Japanese, both in terms of my ancestral history or in terms of an identity assumed through cultural diffusion or integration. I am an American, and that unfortunately means that I'll be commenting on media that resulted from the aftermath of what my own country's history inflicted on another. This video is not going to be a gigantic moral argument about whether the nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the morally correct decisions, or the most efficient decision as part of the larger American war effort, or the like. Those are arguments that, while I may have my own stances on, I am not equipped to be considered the singular, authoritative voice of reason, or anything even close to such. Considering also that these events are nearly 80 years in the past, it would be wildly presumptuous to think that any insight I have now would be particularly insightful on what happened, or something that has not been said by someone far more articulate or historically informed than myself. I am not here to comment on the real-world event itself as it happened back in August 1945. The purpose of this video is to bring attention to 2 little bits of animation that serve as historical artifacts of Japan itself trying to, and continuing to, reconcile what happened so long ago. These are not specials that you like in the sense that we tend to traditionally associate with the term like, but exist in a different kind of aesthetic space altogether, mostly divorced from conventional notions of entertainment. With all that being said, let's begin with the first special, Girls in Summer Dresses. Girls in Summer Dresses is less about the atomic bomb dropping and more about preceding and contemporary reminiscences surrounding the drop. The film's opening narration tells of Women's Secondary School Number 1, with a real journal that was kept and maintained by the Year 1 Class 6 students to tell of their successes and achievements. Throughout the course of the special, we follow the lives of a few select girls who were in that class named Yoko, Hitomi, and Noboko, bringing us almost directly into what life in wartime Japan was like for someone who would have been traveling to attend the school. We see feminine etiquette classes about how to properly sit and gesture as one might normally expect, but we also get a glimpse of some of the harsher realities. Children walk home in straight and orderly lines within groups as a precaution for safety against airstrikes from Americans. There is a shortage of material for making the usual summer dresses that girls would have worn in school, and there were restrictions on wearing white since it can be seen more visibly from the skies and to make the girls potential civilian targets. During its fixations on the past, it takes on the visual format and style that we've come to associate with anime, but disposes of the traditional sense of fiction that also comes associated with the medium. The series thus relies on a rather interesting angle to the whole approach. After all, anime is not typically regarded as the preferred medium of storytelling when it comes to the presentation of factual information, even in historical fiction or fiction that was based on real events. Documentaries, textbooks, encyclopedias, and others already take care of that for us, divorced from the normal sense of narrative that we associate with conventional animated works like the 3-act structure or clearly delineated characters. Girls in Summer Dresses does utilize those narrative qualities to an extent, in that it follows these 3 children specifically during the course of its 35-minute runtime, and might have to extrapolate a few details in order to give the special some kind of center. However, the special poses as a fictionalization in name only, buoyed by a disquieting realism that everything we're seeing transpire is something that can be reasonably implied to have happened. With the journal as the fulcrum that balances everything together, it uses animation to bring to life a kind of unusual quaintness that feels devoid of any usual standard of dramatism. Unlike certain moments like the firebombs in the exposition for Grave of the Fireflies, there aren't really any scenes that depict action, at least in the sense that we normally use the term. Actions do take place within these moments, and it's in realizing this that the animated segments manage to work, almost like a series of small vignettes that are loosely tied together. It occurs in moments like when the girls are huddled in the cave after a siren goes off and the teacher tells them to take shelter. It occurs in moments like when the students want to sing a particular song to commemorate their summer dresses being finished. And yes, it also occurs in the final moments when the bomb goes off in a flash. Because these small moments pepper the special, they all act as melancholic reflections of a bygone time that would end with their eventual deaths, the last days of any kind of peacefulness that the girls might have known or envisioned. In a tragic sense, Girls in Summer Dresses asks its audience to realize the last vestiges of a different kind of slice of life. To be sure, this slice of life was already on shaky ground considering the overall circumstances of contemporary World War II, but it was still a slice of life nonetheless. People had to live their lives and go about the day, even under such extenuations. However, the main aspect of the special that really ties it all together is not necessarily the animated portions, but rather how they work in conjunction with the live-action portions. Intercut with the animated portions are the, at the time, surviving relatives of the school children that the special fixates on. We see Yoko's father play the song that he meant for Yoko to hear when he returned from his tour of duty, but that she never did. Hitomi's mother, barely able to walk even with a cane, visits a grave. We see Nobuko's parents, who still lived in the same house 40+ years later, take out the dress Nobuko worked to make. They unfold it and touch it like a sacred object, as though the thought of any other blemishes other than the blemishes already on it would be too painful to experience. We learn that the same dress was eventually donated to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. Even in the midst of their attempts at being stoic as they provide a little reflective commentary of their own, the sadness reverberates through the relatives' words and their actions. The lack of music and presence of ambient noise creates a stillness that makes for effective filmmaking, emphasizing that the moment is about these people and the grim reality that they've outlived their children. Like some other films such as Alain René's Nuit et Brouillard or Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, Girls in Summer Dresses understands that actually seeing people grieve, or the scenery of the present long after a tragedy or horror occurred, can act as an important ingredient to keep the significance of a memorial or testimonial alive. Especially in regards to tragedies within history, we tend to conceive of them in the abstract, even when we have photographs or videos of them occurring. We are always viewing these things from a window, separated by geography, culture, or time. The animated portions are, in essence, the special's way of keeping these people and their children alive in memory. To quote Star Trek The Next Generation's episode The Inner Light for just a moment, quote, "If you remember what we were and how we lived, then we'll have found life again," end quote. Everyone dies at some point, with some lives being taken far too early. And to be sure, Girls in Summer Dresses could never perfectly recreate Japanese life, or the life of the three girls, in the days leading up to August 6, 1945. No anime or documentary could actually do that with the lack of video or photographic footage. But what matters more is that it sincerely tries in the best way that it set out to do. It's for this reason why all the animated portions and the live-action portions never come across as either exploitive or in poor taste. Like the overall quiet sound within the special, Girls in Summer Dresses is quiet, ruminative, and plays itself like an elegy, using the few creative liberties it has to paint a sincere picture of loss and sorrow. While it's true that in a perfect world, every real person's tragedy would be captured and understood, the inability to realize that should not disincentivize telling the stories that we can. When all is said and done, this special tackles the few stories it has with utmost seriousness. And that is, perhaps, all that can be reasonably asked of it. The first train runs to Hiroshima opts instead to delve more into the realms of historical fiction than its predecessor did, dispensing with any sense of docudrama and focusing more on being an entirely self-contained story set in the past. It likewise attempts to depict life both just before and just after the bomb dropping, following the story of Yayoi, a girl who works on a trolley car as the bell ringer and attendant, occasionally sleeping in a house with other young female workers. As she goes about her day working on the trolley, she occasionally bumps into Yamamoto-sensei as he pedals his way to their school. The days are long and everyone works hard, best encapsulated with the image of all the girls in Yamamoto's class sleeping and he cannot bring himself to wake them up. He lets them enjoy some time outside in the sun to enjoy the spring of youth. Other familiar images and iconographies related to wartime Japan show themselves, such as the precious rarity that is sweets and an overall tone of melancholy even in the midst of supposedly peaceful days. Girls in Summer Dresses depicted suffering without really showing the actual atomic blast and the resulting devastation itself in animated form, leaving most of those familiar images or sensibilities to be left to the imagination. The suffering it depicted was more in line with the slice-of-life snippets of the girls we saw, or the parents in the contemporary present grieving their loved ones. The first train runs to Hiroshima opts for a different approach instead, spending more of its time making the devastation concrete within its second half. The bomb dropping is presented more as an event within the story itself, rather than an abstract specter hanging over it all. The mushroom cloud itself is never seen, but the hard transition between smiling as though it were an ordinary day, and then the characters having to actually live in the aftermath and aftershock of the bombing. In its own way, this does work. It reflects the suddenness of how the event took place, a flash both in metaphorical and literal action. The brighter colors of the story are replaced instead with a tableau of black and red, the music adopting a more modernist feel with its dissonance and voices, a single cello trying to create a languished melody as though the player doesn't have much strength to move their bow. The imagery is punctuated further by Yayoi walking alone in the midst of all the ruined landscapes surrounding her, allowing the scene to simply take over as more of an emotive sensory experience. The whole sequence plays almost like a death march. There isn't a caravan of the dead being carried along, although we do at one point see blue fires burning with corpses. The intent instead is to juxtapose just how small Yayoi is in comparison to everything surrounding her. In the rubble of destroyed buildings and a leg sticking out of the debris, charred and unrecognizable, Yayoi cannot really do anything. She is a small presence in an otherwise dead sea, only able to be horrified at what she's witnessing. And yet, despite all the tragedy surrounding everyone and how small Yayoi seems, The special ultimately ends on a more hopeful note rather than something that dwells for too long in its morose mood. As the trolley passes through the ruins and people are trying to pick up the pieces of their surroundings, Yayoi evidently goes against the advice of the trolley driver and rings the bell, alerting people to their presence in the area. After they surround the trolley and board it, Yayoi takes the time to reflect on what has happened and commits herself to continuing to ride the trolley, ringing the bell many times over in the future, and letting people hear it so that they too can possibly keep moving along in their own way. And when a new day comes, the trolley comes again, with Yayoi ringing the bell just like before and gazing into a bleak future, but for now in this moment, the sun is shining. There is an unfortunate overhang that clouds the anime's hopeful ending, and it's that many of the people that we see in it who are struggling to survive likely will not do so. The initial blast from the atomic bomb may have caused horrible devastation and death, including of one of Yayoi's friends within the story, but the potential radiation poisoning that also exists will likely send many of these survivors either to hospitals or their own deaths. In that vein, Yayoi's actions at the end could be seen as a kind of Sisyphean task, eternally rolling a metaphorical boulder up a mountain that her own efforts can't fix, and that she will likely fall victim to the tragedy at a later time via sickness too. And after all, what can one little girl and one little trolley do in the midst of all this melancholy and heartache? However, getting hung up on this point, I think, underscores the far more poignant message within. These people, even at their darkest hour, are still alive. When Yayoi rings the bell and alerts everyone that the trolley is passing through, it is not simply saying that they're present. Instead, it's that they are present, that they can rebuild together, and they will rebuild together. And ultimately, that's what Japan did. The idea of a nation's enduring spirit is represented for this fixed moment in time by a single trolley and a little girl doing all that she can to help in her own small way. There is no step too small when it comes to rebuilding or healing one's own person or one's own community. It might be one girl and her trolley, but the point is that one girl and her trolley are still here. Even if they won't last forever, and whatever fate awaits them, their presence does provide a small speck of light in a dark, uncertain world and future. There's an old Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood clip and saying that finds its way around the internet sometimes whenever something particularly devastating or terrible happens in the world. It reminds its audience that in the wake of tragedy to look for the helpers. Maybe that's the reason why, for as brief a time as it may be, Yayoi in the midst of such sadness feels so warm, even against such a horrible backdrop. Girls in Summer Dresses functions like a quasi-docudrama. The first train runs to Hiroshima is the story of a helper. No matter how young she is or how much she can do, and it is rather sappy, it's all part of a beautiful naivete that carries itself throughout the special. And in the wake of such a horrible, cynical circumstance, perhaps a little naivete could be just what we need. Towards the start of this video, I mentioned that both Girls in Summer Dresses and The First Train Runs to Hiroshima have largely flown under the anime community's radar, and I do believe that to be true. It is not simply because these entries on sites like AniList or Mal do not have a lot of people who have listed it on their profiles, but also because of something else entirely. Part of the anime community's mystique, I suppose you could call it, is that it has members who will scrounge the furthest corners of the internet or archives in order to find and upload things that had previously gone unnoticed, which includes fan-subbing projects that never got official releases elsewhere. And it's that last point I find quite fascinating. Neither one of these specials has ever been given a fully subtitled translation, at least in English. Girls in Summer Dresses is about 80% subtitled, but has several moments of particular importance where no translation is provided, thus potentially robbing the moments of some of their inherent emotional weight. Though it does have a Spanish dub that I will link in the video's description. The First Train Runs to Hiroshima, at least as far as I could gather, has never been touched by a fan subgroup, leaving the entirety of the whole to be implied through its imagery and music alone, for someone like me whose Japanese is so paper thin that I couldn't form anything beyond the most basic sentences, if even that. I have admittedly spent a lot of this video talking about things that directly happen within these specials, rather than devoting time to more overt thematic analysis, because, well, let's be frank for a minute, trying to create a long-form video out of 2 pieces of media that are only 35 minutes long is a bit difficult without delving into spoilers. But I do hope that your curiosity is piqued to the point where you'll check these out for yourself. In our bid to see all the story-centered anime we can get our hands on, it sometimes is refreshing and necessary to see something that is either far off the beaten path or more about the exploration of an idea rather than a conventionally narrative coherent feature. For such a uniquely different chapter of human history, it's perhaps most fitting that we have two uniquely different commemorations of that day and time. I don't know how much this means coming from me, but I'm glad that these two specials exist, and I am glad that I saw them.